Revolutionary War is done. Now what do we do with this new land? What do we do with a new nation? How do you govern it? How do you have very independent states held together? And how do you keep that bond in the new nation? That's the question we're going to explore with this mini lecture, a new political order and how to run a nation with a new government. So to do this, y'all, we're going to be looking all from chapter 8. So this is to supplement a very interesting chapter packed with information. So be sure to read the chapter. But this is to help create a narrative and bring some of the ideas together. So we're going to explore a few parts. First off, going back to, remember the 7 Years' War, remember the French and Indian War. What was the main area that it was in dispute? The Ohio River Valley. And then there was a proclamation line put in by the British government to stop colonists going into the territory and to uphold an agreement with the natives in the territory who owned the land. Well, that line's abolished. It's a new nation. It's a new time. What do we do with that? And so we're going to look at how to deal with the Ohio River Valley, how to deal with westward expansion and the future of United States growth. That's a big thing. But then also, what are we going to do with the government? So the government was largely right after the Declaration of Independence was put together of the Articles of Confederation that created a confederation government, which is really, if you think about it, each state, each of the 13 states had its own entity, which is its own thing, but what held them all together was a very unstable glue, and that glue was these Articles of Confederation. That glue does not stick for too long. It's kind of like Elmer's glue. It's good for a time, but over time, its stickiness wears off. And that's kind of what's happening with the Articles of Confederation. So as that power's dwindling, as that adhesiveness is starting to unravel, then what's going to put in its place? How can we fuse it together rather than Elmer's glue, but weld it together with something stronger that really holds the nation together? And that's the journey that the nation went on. And we're going to explore that. So some questions that really come together from this and also the chapter 8 are, what was the Confederation government? Why was it so limited? And what were its benefits and failures? So think about the Confederation government and some pros and cons to it. But then also we're going to look at what led to a new government and to the creation of a new U.S. Constitution. We're going to see that there was lots of constitutions. In fact, there was 13. Every state had its own constitution. But what allowed him to create one constitution? So we're going to look at that. Some key words to keep in mind as you go through this mini lecture and also the reading is Articles of Confederation, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Shays' Rebellion, both the Virginia Plan and New Jersey Plan, the Federalists, and if you know the Federalists, you'll figure out what the Anti-Federalists are, and those are really important to help guide you into the Constitution, the new government, and where we're at today in the 21st century. So I hope this will guide you through not only this lecture, but chapter 8 as well. So to get us started, we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation right here. Now, the Articles of Confederation, like I said, came shortly after the Declaration of Independence. So it guided the nation through the war. And that really was its primary purpose. It was to create an army, to hold the army together, to manage the army, the continental government, the continental army, to all work together. But then after that, it had very little power. In peacetime, it was not really meant to have that much strength. The strength came in the individual states, and federal government was very limited, and definitely limited in a confederation government. It had largely three main components to it: paying the large war debt that was created from the long, very expensive Revolutionary War, making formal peace with Native Americans, and also dealing with westward expansion and westward settlement. This should sound kind of familiar because if you remember, after the 7 Years' War, after the French Indian War, the British government was dealing with largely the same thing in the territory. They were dealing with how to pay their large war debt, how to figure out and make peace with everybody that they went to war with, including unofficially the natives in the same region of the Ohio River Valley and west of the colonies. Remember Pontiac's Rebellion? So, and then also they just put a line in there with the proclamation line of 1763, but we don't have that in this new nation. They have to deal with westward expansion. In fact, they want to expand the nation, and they need to look at how to do that. And the Confederation government was meant to provide the means for that. So one major way that the Confederation government looked to expand westward and to really create a system of getting people to move west was in 1785 with the Land Ordinance. Now, this established a grid system, made it easier. In fact, the grid system that we still see today when you're flying in from airports and you're able to look down and see very clearly grids of the land, this is where you largely get it coming about. You see this, it makes it very different than when you fly into Europe and other places, because the whole nation is largely, in the United States, is developed because of this land ordinance system that helps really divide up the land in an easy, manageable way. And for this case, what they did, and largely with the help of Thomas Jefferson, was to create this grid system to then assess the good land, the bad land, and the worst land, the land that you couldn't do much with. They auctioned it off at $1 per acre. And 50% of towns needed to be sold into single blocks of 23,000 acres. The minimum that you could buy was around 640 acres. But this was to buy it off and to also sell it at a very low price to get people moving west. Now, of course, this is people with means, because even at that time, especially after the war, the money was scarce, and it was for people with already landowners or had means, had some sort of way of paying for this westward movement, and to create a new direction in West. Now, this was not with any communication, of course, with the Native Americans of the area, with no policy in place. This was strictly going into the territory and occupying already established land. So we must remember that when telling this narrative. But it did create this fervor to move westward, and it expanded the ideas. When Thomas Jefferson becomes president after 1800, this is going to be a central tenet of his government of agrarian reform. But he gets to start here as a congressman in this confederation to try to get people to move westward at a very successful rate. And the other part of this, a couple of years later, was called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the Land Ordinance of 1785, and then what moves into the Land Ordinance of 1787. I don't want to lose you now. Come on. I got you. This is an important thing, though. It's not just a bunch of numbers and names thrown at you, because this here sets the stage for how the United States is to grow and how the regions west didn't become colonies. If you think about it, those original 13 colonies, they were the ones that moved westward and colonized the region west in the name of certain states. So Virginia expanded west. You can actually see it better in this. I'll come back to that last slide, but you can see it here. So Pennsylvania, they had land westward here. Connecticut, New York had land here. Georgia moved westward to here. North Carolina moved, which became Tennessee. So all these colonies, when they were able to move across the Appalachian Mountains into this new territory, it was kind of a colony to their original state. The first colony, then state, and this is a new colony for them. But the idea of a Northwest Ordinance stopped that from happening. It stopped it from being a colony, and created a system where it was able to become a state in itself. So how they were able to do that was this 3-stage process where people settling in this region were able then to eventually create a state depending on the population that moved into the region. So the first stage was people in that area had a representative to represent and voice their opinions in the government. But that was assigned to them, and there was no voting rights. Secondly, after there was about 5,000 male voters in that region, they were then able to elect their own official, who then was their voice in government, but that still didn't have an elected voice. They were able to voice their religion, kind of like the colonies were with the British government, right? So they're going to be text, but without representation, really. That's a problem if you're going to be a state. So it's still kind of a colony. It's a territory. But then after you get 60,000 voters, if you have a region with 60,000 voters, so you have a pretty good town, a couple towns probably, then you're able to then get your own elected official, have that voice in Congress or in the government, and they're able then to start the process of ratifying it to become a state. So there's a process. This is incredibly important because it sets up the stage of westward expansion, not as territories or as colonies that's supposed to just be a wild, uncharted territory, and sort of just bringing back taxes and doing their own thing. It was the process to create a state. It was a process to expand the boundaries of the United States and to expand it into new state formations, entities of themselves. So beyond having them create the steps for the territories to then become states, they were also trying to deal with the very important issue that this was actually Native American land. Native Americans were in the area. And in the very brief document that was this Northwest Ordinance, it does specify to how to deal with Native Americans and in a humane way. So it's supposed to acknowledge their rights and lawful authority of natives of the region. Now, it's a nice idea on paper. In reality, they're infringing on land that belongs to Native Americans. And in reality, that process is going to get ugly as there's going to be conflict, and it was conflict, and it was brutal, and it was gruesome, and it's actually going to get even worse once you get to Jefferson becoming president and later Andrew Jackson. We'll get to that in a few weeks' time. But this starts that process off. On one hand, saying, yes, everybody has rights, including Native Americans in the region, but on practice and with the laws, it was very specific that the laws went to the people settling in the region, not the Native Americans. That's the important narrative that needs to be understood. The third part of that is dealing with slavery. How do you deal with slavery in these regions? And it was actually Thomas Jefferson, famous for the amount of slave-owning plantation that he had and being sort of a major proponent of one of the founding fathers with slaves. However, he was the one that was really trying to ratify the end of slavery in new territories. And he did it before, and he definitely did it with this Northwest Ordinance. And it was passed. It was unanimously passed that it would happen north of the Ohio River. So the idea that slavery would not be happening north of the Ohio River. Later, this will become, you will look at the Mason-Dixon line as a major line, a demarcation between slave and free states. But now we're looking at the Ohio River Valley as the demarcation. And it also specifically dealt with fugitive slave laws. And this we're going to look at later in the 1800s. But the idea that if any slave escaped and was a fugitive and passes into this region, they then had to be returned back to their slave owner. So on one hand, African Americans are free in this territory, but on the other hand, those that are slaves are still property and need to be returned to their owner. So it's very it's very conflicted in its views and its ways of the law, and that's going to continue on until the end of the Civil War, in its different forms. So it's very important that this Northwest Ordinance sets the stage for three things. It sets the stage for expansion and with state formation and how each state is going to be able to be ratified through this process. Number two, that there is talk of how to deal with Native Americans in the region, but in practice, It's really all about the expansion of these colonial areas and eventually trying to create them as states. So that's going to reign supreme, and that's going to happen throughout the 1800s. And also the slave issue of how to deal with slave states in these regions, and making a line saying that in the south of the Ohio River Valley is a slave area, north of that is not. And that sets the stage as well of how this is going to happen for the rest of the country's development and the slave issue. Now, also, with the Articles of Confederation, we don't have one U.S. Constitution yet. We have 13 constitutions. So each state has its own constitution, and how they deal with slavery is very different as well. And it's important to understand that, yes, okay, all nature equally free and independent. That's what's written, and that's what the Enlightenment ideals of the time always talk about, rights of the individual. Okay, but what about slavery? When it's specifically written and when it's expected that slaves are property, whose rights are you protecting? Are you protecting the slave owner, and are you protecting their rights to have property, or are you going to uphold the fact that that property is in fact a person themselves and have rights of their own? So that becomes convoluted and tension between, and that's going to happen up until the Civil War again, but we're looking at how each state deals with that, and each state writes it differently in their own state's constitution. So states' constitutions based on the authority of the people, and each state's people looked at this question differently. In New Jersey's constitution, they gave rights, and quote, to maids or widow, black or white. So not only did male in New Jersey, before the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, women had the rights to vote, maids had the right to vote, widows had the rights to property, to land owning, and black or white had the same rights. They were seen as equal citizens in the state of New Jersey. And of course, this is before the U.S. Constitution. Massachusetts Constitution were very explicit and said all men are born free and equal. And so everybody had the rights. And so African Americans, women, men had equal rights, and a lot more equal rights than what was to happen with a ratification of the U.S. Constitution, because other states talked about having no rights for slaves, no rights for African Americans who were freed. And so when all 13 states had to come together to decide one constitution rather than 13, this became a very touchy subject. And in some cases, including women and African Americans, rights were lost. An important thing to think about.